rock and roll singer Rick Nelson was killed last night in a private plane crash in Texas. Officials say that his charter DC-3 caught fire in flight and crashed while trying to make an emergency landing.
Ricky Nelson boarded the plane that night, expecting to wake up in Dallas. But on New Year's Eve, 1985, Ricky Nelson's final flight ended in flames.
Rick Nelson and 5 band members on their way to a Dallas hotel for a New Year's Eve concert, all killed. The charter Douglas DC-3 reportedly caught fire in midair. The pilot tried first to land the plane on a road.
The accident was tragic, but the real mystery wasn't the fire or the wreckage. It was what happened inside that plane before it hit the ground. 2 people survived. Ricky didn't. One crew member even confessed he had a bad feeling about that flight and swore never to fly that plane again. Some say it was a tragic accident. Others believe something or someone didn't want that plane to land. The flight that ended it all. On New Year's Eve, 1985, as the whole world was about to cross over into a new year, Ricky Nelson was in the sky, chasing another performance and another chance to prove he still mattered. His plane had taken off from a small airstrip in Guntersville, Alabama, and was bound for Dallas, Texas, where he was scheduled to perform at a New Year's Eve concert. On board this plane were 9 people: Nelson, his fiancée, Helen Blair, 5 members of his band, and 2 pilots named Brad Rank and Ken Ferguson. Most of the passengers were asleep, stretched across benches or curled into corners in the back of the aircraft, unaware that their journey would soon end in the most tragic way ever. Ricky had flown in that exact plane countless times. In fact, he'd purchased it himself and had it customized for his tours. Despite the aircraft being old, Ricky trusted it. He had learned this ability to trust when he stepped into the public eye as the fresh-faced teenage son on The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, and was thrown into a spotlight that would never truly let him go. He learned early how to smile through pressure, how to sing while the world watched his every move. And that pressure followed him into adulthood, through faded record deals, difficult relationships, and the constant expectation to live up to the boy wonder he once was. But that night, at the age of 45, Ricky was no longer the chart topper he used to be. But he was still performing and still fighting for his place in the industry that once crowned him a prince. Unfortunately, that night fate had other plans. Somewhere in the air, about 40 minutes into the ill-fated flight, everything went wrong. Eyewitnesses on the ground later reported seeing flickers of flame trailing behind the aircraft before it went down. Others described a faint column of black smoke bleeding across the dusk sky. And inside the cockpit, the pilots radioed air traffic control with an alarming message that said, "We've got a little problem. Smoke in the cockpit." But it wasn't just a little problem. In fact, the smoke spread fast, and within minutes, the rear cabin was filled with it. The musicians, many of whom were likely sleeping, woke up to thick, acrid air and burning eyes. Panic would have set in quickly, as the pilots, who were separated from the main cabin by a closed door, managed to stay in control of the aircraft long enough to attempt an emergency landing in a wide cow pasture just outside DeKalb. The descent was rough, but it didn't kill them. It was what came next that did. After landing, the plane came to rest against a fence line, but within moments, flames engulfed the cabin. For reasons that weren't immediately clear, only the cockpit crew, Rank and Ferguson, were able to escape. They kicked out the side windows and climbed to safety, suffering only minor injuries. Unfortunately, everyone else, from Ricky to Helen and the band, was trapped inside. When first responders finally arrived, the aircraft was already ablaze, and by the time the flames were extinguished, it was too late. 7 lives were gone. The heartbreaking news spread quickly across the world, leaving many stunned. Ricky Nelson, one of America's original teen idols, a man whose voice once echoed through living rooms coast to coast, had left the world under tragic circumstances on New Year's Eve. But as tributes poured in, so did questions. Why had the plane caught fire in the first place? Why had only the pilots survived? And the most chilling question of all, what really happened in those final minutes? Initial reports only deepened the mystery. Some early rumors suggested the fire had started because someone on board had been experimenting with illicit substances, and this became a claim that the tabloids ran with, despite zero physical evidence. Other rumors hinted at mechanical failure or poor maintenance and even sabotage. But even that didn't explain why everyone in the back died while the cockpit crew made it out alive. Investigators combed through the wreckage. The cockpit was damaged, but intact. The rear cabin, however, was obliterated by the fire. No soot was found in the lungs of the victims, suggesting that they had died of smoke inhalation, possibly within moments of the fire breaking out. And yet the source of the fire was still a mystery. For years, the mystery lingered, and the doubts never fully disappeared. What caused the smoke? Could more have been done? And why did this have to happen? Now, decades later, we finally have the answers that were buried in the details and overlooked in the rush to assign blame. These answers change everything we thought we knew about Ricky Nelson's passing. But here's the truth. These questions didn't begin the night of the crash. They'd been following Ricky Nelson for years. Because long before his name was etched in tragedy, Ricky was battling a different kind of fire that began as early as his childhood. Fame, for him, had come early and fast, but it did at a cost that would follow him for the rest of his life and ultimately lead to his demise. Ricky, the reluctant star. Perhaps the major reason why Ricky Nelson's death hit so close to home for many fans is the fact that he literally grew up in front of a microphone with his childhood playing out on American radio and, later, television. As the younger son of Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, he was part of The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, a scripted sitcom that blurred the line between real life and performance. It began on radio in the 1940s and made the jump to TV in 1952, running for a staggering 14 seasons. The show didn't just showcase the Nelson family, it was the Nelson family. And for Ricky, that meant his first real job was playing himself. Millions of Americans watched Ricky grow up every week, smiling at the dinner table, cracking innocent jokes, and living the textbook suburban teen life. But behind the scenes, Ricky was quieter, more reserved, and not nearly as eager for attention as the role required. He didn't chase the spotlight. It was handed to him and then expected of him. Most fans don't even realize that music, for Ricky, didn't start as a career plan. In 1957, at the young age of 17, Ricky recorded a cover of Fats Domino's "I'm Walkin'" to impress his girlfriend. Surprisingly, the producers liked it, and the network aired it. And just like that, Ricky had a hit. The single was super successful, and later that year, he followed it up with "Poor Little Fool," which went down in history as the first ever #1 song on the newly launched Billboard Hot 100 chart. For a while, Ricky Nelson became a phenomenon. Between 1957 and 1973, he released over 50 charting singles. He wasn't just a teen idol anymore. He was the prototype. Clean-cut, good-looking, and backed by television exposure that most artists could only dream of. But even as the charts filled with his name, something about the whole setup felt artificial to him. Ricky didn't enjoy the business aspect of music, and he quietly bristled at the idea of being anyone's manufactured heartthrob. So as the 1960s rolled in and the pop scene shifted, Ricky began pulling away from the spotlight. He started writing his own songs, experimenting with new sounds, and eventually transitioned into country rock, a genre that felt closer to his real voice, both musically and emotionally. He formed the Stone Canyon Band in the late 60s, a group that allowed him to perform on his own terms, away from the constraints of his early image. But the shift didn't land smoothly with longtime fans. In fact, during a performance at Madison Square Garden's Oldies show in 1971, Ricky played a mix of his classics and new material, and the crowd wasn't having it, not because of his talent, but because he didn't stick to the hits. But rather than hide from the moment, he wrote about it. In 1972, Ricky released Garden Party, a semi-autobiographical song about the night he got booed, which ended up becoming a surprise hit, reaching the top 10 and proving Ricky still had something to say and a fan base willing to listen. It was his last major chart success, but one of the most personal songs he ever released. But for all his success on stage and screen, Ricky's greatest challenges rarely played out in public. The real tension in his life wasn't between him and the audience. It was between who he was expected to be and who he actually was. And behind the music, that battle was just beginning. Personal battles behind the fame. Fame gave Ricky Nelson everything, until it quietly took more than anyone realized. To the outside world, he was the image of success. A teenage heartthrob who seamlessly became a music star, all while America watched from their living rooms. But behind the scenes was a young man quietly carrying a lifetime of emotional weight. Many fans never realized that, from childhood, Ricky struggled with asthma, a condition that followed him into his adulthood. The breathing issues were serious enough to land him in the hospital multiple times. But the physical strain was only part of it, and the chronic health problems fueled something deeper. And that was anxiety, nervousness, and a need for space that people often mistook for aloofness. While his peers enjoyed relatively normal childhoods, Ricky's life was literally scripted. Every week, he had lines to memorize, scenes to perform, and expectations to meet. And even when the cameras were off, the show never really stopped. That's because his father, Ozzie Nelson, wasn't just the co-star of The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. He was the director, producer, and manager. Ozzie ran everything, including Ricky's career, finances, contracts, performances, and even what kind of music Ricky recorded. In public, their relationship looked wholesome, but in private, it was more complicated. Ricky respected his father's intelligence and drive, but the tight grip came at a cost. As Ricky grew older, he struggled with a lack of autonomy, constantly trying to balance being a dutiful son with the need to carve out his own identity. Even after the TV show ended and Ricky began transitioning into country rock, his father still remained involved in many of his business decisions, and this quietly frustrated Ricky for years. And unfortunately, while early fame had made him rich, the money didn't last. By the 1980s, Ricky was facing serious financial trouble. Despite dozens of hit singles and sold-out tours in earlier decades, he found himself buried under a growing pile of debt. The reasons were mismanagement, high expenses, and a slowdown in commercial success. Unlike many stars, Ricky didn't live an outrageously lavish lifestyle, but years of touring, maintaining staff, and keeping up appearances had drained his bank account. But he wasn't the type to ask for help or make a scene, and so instead, he kept going, booking shows in smaller venues and pressing forward, hoping things would eventually turn around. Behind the scenes, however, the pressure was mounting, and it followed him onto the road. Ironically, one of the biggest sources of stress in Ricky's life was flying. He had a lifelong fear of air travel. Friends and family recalled how visibly nervous he'd get before flights, often gripping the armrests, fidgeting, or falling into silence. The fear wasn't entirely irrational. He was hyper-aware of how many musicians had died in plane crashes, and he knew the risks. But touring by bus wasn't an option he was willing to take. Ricky valued privacy and control, and tour buses didn't give him either. The compromise was to fly on his own terms. That's why he purchased his plane and customized it to feel more like a living room than an aircraft, just so it could help him relax. But it never completely cured the fear. Every flight was a quiet battle with his nerves, and every takeoff is a moment of trust. And in many ways, that fear symbolized Ricky's entire life. He was constantly trying to stay composed while everything underneath was uncertain. On stage, he looked calm. In interviews, he was polite and measured. But inside, he carried the weight of decades, of a childhood without privacy, of fame without control, and of success that felt impossible to keep up with. He rarely complained. Instead, he kept pushing forward and touring towns that barely remembered his last hit. He was also raising 4 children while quietly fighting to keep his footing. And although he didn't self-destruct like many of his peers, the slow, grinding toll of fame wore him down all the same. But as the pressures of money, control, and public expectation piled up, so did the cracks in his personal life. However, this next battle in his life wasn't one of fame or fortune, but of love and family. Because behind closed doors, Ricky Nelson's marriage was beginning to fall apart. A marriage in turmoil. By the early 1960s, Ricky Nelson seemed to have it all with the chart-topping singles, a nationwide fan base, and a wholesome public image that made him one of America's most admired young stars. But behind the glitz and glamour, his personal life was already starting to fracture. In April 1963, Ricky married Kristen Harmon, an actress and painter from a well-known Hollywood family. She was the daughter of football star Tom Harmon and actress Elise Knox, and the sister of actor Mark Harmon. At the time of the marriage, Kristen was just 18 years old, while Ricky was 23. On paper, it looked like a picture-perfect match. 2 attractive young stars starting a family in the glow of early fame. But their relationship, like much of Ricky's life, was hit with pressure. In the early years, they were often seen in public as the modern and artistic family. But at home, things weren't as ideal as the press photos suggested. By the 1970s, Kristen had begun struggling with substance abuse. The fast pace of living under the spotlight, the emotional stress of fading fame, and the pressures of parenting while constantly on tour created a toxic environment. But Kristen and Ricky tried to save the marriage. In fact, at one point, the couple entered therapy. But according to reports, Ricky eventually stopped attending the sessions, retreating into his work and distancing himself emotionally. He was touring more, staying away longer, and spending most of his time trying to keep his career afloat. Kristen, meanwhile, was left trying to hold the home together while quietly unraveling herself. The separation dragged on for years, filled with arguments, long silences, and custody disputes. Friends of the couple noted that they were often at odds over parenting, finances, and Ricky's travel schedule. And though they kept things relatively private, their marriage was, by most accounts, deeply fractured long before it legally ended. In 1982, the divorce was finalized, marking the end of nearly 2 decades together and ushering in a complicated new chapter, especially for their children. While Ricky continued touring and recording, Kristen began to spiral, eventually checking into rehab to confront her addiction issues. By 1987, her brother, Mark Harmon, a rising TV star at the time, grew concerned about the environment his youngest nephew, Sam, was growing up in. And so, he took legal steps to seek custody of the boy, igniting a brief but public courtroom battle with Kristen. Though they eventually reached a private agreement, the case pulled back the curtain on just how much damage had been done. Ricky, for his part, was just trying to move forward. In the final years of his life, he found companionship in a new relationship with Helen Blair, a 27-year-old part-time model and former waitress who had become a steady presence in his life and on the road. By all accounts, Helen was soft-spoken, loyal, and deeply protective of Ricky. Though they were never officially married, she often introduced herself as his wife, traveled with the band, helped manage tour logistics, and stood by him as his career entered its most uncertain years. But even this relationship was touched by the shadows of Ricky's past. There were trust issues, financial stress, and the lingering emotional weight from the marriage he had never truly recovered from. In 1985, the year of the crash, his finances were stretched. His touring schedule was grueling, and the industry had largely moved on, and he was only doing what he had to do, not what he wanted to. The venues had grown smaller, and the man who once couldn't walk through a mall without being followed was now fighting to stay afloat musically, emotionally, and personally. And so, the aircraft he boarded that night wasn't just a mode of transportation. It was a space where Ricky felt a little more in control and away from the noise. But the reality was more complicated, and the plane, which he had retrofitted to feel luxurious, was aging. And while Ricky had flown on it for years, the cracks were beginning to show, both in the plane and in the life he'd built around it. What happened on that final flight wasn't just a tragedy. It was the breaking point in a long string of quiet battles, and the problems on that flight didn't start in the air. They started long before the wheels left the ground. Did the plane have problems? By the time Ricky Nelson bought that ill-fated aircraft, he wasn't looking for luxury. He was just looking for a way to get his career back on track. The music industry had changed, and his income had slowed. But the road was still calling, and he needed a way to keep touring without depending on unreliable commercial flights or the grind of tour buses. And so, he paid $118,000 for the aircraft that would later claim his life. The plane felt prestigious. It had once belonged to rock legend Jerry Lee Lewis, and before that, to the prestigious DuPont family. The aircraft had style, polished metal, a classic silhouette, and a retrofitted cabin complete with carpeted floors, cushioned benches, and an onboard stereo. For a traveling band, it looked perfect. But what it had in charm, it lacked in reliability. From the beginning, the aircraft came with mechanical baggage. It was over 40 years old. Though these planes were known for durability, this particular model had racked up thousands of flight hours. And for every upgrade it had received over the years, there were still aging components that were wearing out. In fact, not too long after buying the plane, problems started to show. During one trip, a major engine issue occurred, and it was so severe that the plane couldn't even taxi on its own. Ground crew reportedly had to manually push it down the runway. It was an embarrassing scene for a touring musician, but it was also a warning sign that was ignored. Things worsened. In September 1985, some months after the aircraft was purchased, Ricky was scheduled to perform at one of the biggest concerts of the year. But surprisingly, the aircraft never made it off the ground. The problem was blamed on a failed ignition magneto, a critical engine component that helps generate the spark needed to start and run the aircraft. Without it, the plane was inoperable. And just like that, The plane was grounded. These kinds of failures weren't routine. They were serious, and they increased the risks of every future flight. Still, the show had to go on. The magneto was replaced, and the aircraft was cleared for air again. But underneath the fixes, there were lingering issues, especially with the cabin heater, a unit vital for flights in cold weather. The heater had a history of malfunctioning. Crew members noted strange smells and unpredictable behavior. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it started, ran briefly, and then cut off without warning. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous, because on aircraft, heater units burn aviation fuel to generate hot air. This means that if they malfunction, they can release toxic fumes or even ignite small fires. And on Ricky's final flight, these red flags would lead to something fatal. But the real tragedy on that flight wasn't just the fire. It was the lack of response. According to federal reports and later testimony, the flight crew, pilot Brad Rank and co-pilot Ken Ferguson, did not activate onboard fire extinguishers. They did not use oxygen masks, and they did not initiate emergency procedures in a timely way. The cockpit was sealed off from the cabin, and the only known communication with air traffic control was a calm but vague transmission alerting them of smoke in the cockpit. What's even more sad is the fact that the aircraft was not equipped with modern fire suppression systems. There were extinguishers on board, but they were never used. Looking at the facts, the tragedy was a vivid compilation of ignored warnings. The plane had shown signs of weakness. Mechanical faults had been documented months earlier, and the final flight followed the same script. Only this time, the consequences were fatal. This wasn't just a case of bad luck. It was a case of bad signs being brushed aside. And with the wreckage of the plane smoldering in an East Texas pasture, investigators were left to sort through the damage, searching not just for what happened, but for how many chances there were to prevent it. With national headlines buzzing and grieving fans demanding answers, the burden fell to investigators. And when they took an in-depth look at what had gone wrong that night, the answers were both heartbreaking and disturbing. The investigation findings. In the days after the crash, speculation moved faster than the facts. Rumors filled newspaper columns. Some whispered about illicit substances. Others pushed theories of sabotage or even foul play. But when the dust settled, it wasn't the gossip that answered the questions. It was the cold, methodical work of federal investigators. The National Transportation Safety Board, the agency responsible for determining the causes of aviation accidents in the United States, launched a full-scale inquiry into the crash of Ricky Nelson's aircraft. The process would take months. Their job was not to guess, assume, or follow tabloid headlines. It was to investigate what actually happened in the final moments of the flight, and why 7 people never made it out alive. But what they found painted a picture of tragedy shaped not by mystery, but by preventable failures. The agency's final report was inconclusive, but noted that the fire most likely started in the rear cabin, specifically near the floor on the right-hand side of the aircraft. That was the area where Ricky and the rest of the passengers had been seated. The exact ignition source could not be determined with certainty, but investigators strongly suspected the aircraft's heater unit as the most probable cause. It was a logical conclusion. The heater had a known record of malfunctioning. On the day of the flight, it reportedly failed to start properly again. In fact, the heater model used in that aircraft had a reputation for being temperamental and, in some instances, hazardous when not maintained properly. Ricky's plane had a history of inconsistent performance, and no verified recent overhaul had been documented. Investigators found physical evidence that added weight to their suspicion. Most notably, the heater door fasteners were unfastened, a detail that suggested someone may have attempted to inspect or access the heater during the flight, possibly in response to a suspected malfunction. But whether the door was left unsecured during maintenance or opened mid-flight could not be definitively determined. But it raised an important red flag. If hot air or fuel vapors were released into the cabin through an unsecured heater compartment, a fire could ignite quickly, especially in an aircraft with carpet, fabric walls, and wooden paneling. Once the fire began, the sequence of events moved rapidly and fatally. As smoke filled the cabin, the crew opened outside air vents, possibly hoping to clear the haze. But this only helped feed the fire with fresh oxygen. Despite having emergency oxygen masks and fire extinguishers on board, the crew did not deploy either. Whether due to panic, disorientation, or underestimation of the threat, the response was minimal, and that decision would prove catastrophic. The smoke became too dense for the passengers to escape. According to the official report, it's likely that those in the rear cabin lost consciousness from inhalation well before the plane touched down. The fire never engulfed the cockpit, which is why both pilots survived. But the rest of the aircraft became a deadly trap. As the pilots attempted an emergency landing near DeKalb, Texas, the plane clipped trees and power lines, which contributed to its rough descent. It skidded through a pasture before coming to a stop, but by then, it was already too late for those inside. Toxicology reports were also conclusive. Some substances were found in Ricky Nelson's system and in the systems of some other passengers, but it was ruled that they had not contributed in any way to the tragedy that happened that night. This put an end to the early media speculation suggesting that substance use had played a role in the crash. There was no evidence of impairment and no signs of foul play, proving that the crash was not the result of reckless behavior or a scandal, but the tragic result of mechanical failure and human misjudgment. In the end, the mystery was resolved not with a twist, but with a devastating truth. This accident could have been prevented. It wasn't sabotage. It was a combination of outdated equipment, warning signs that went unheeded, and a chain of missed opportunities when things started to go wrong. And for Ricky Nelson, a man who had spent his life trying to find space for himself, peace in the chaos of fame, and stability after years of public pressure, that final flight was supposed to be routine. But what awaited him was something no one could outsing, outfly, or fix on the ground. Do you think there was some foul play in Ricky Nelson's death? Drop your answers in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.